Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 331. I hope everybody's doing well out there given the circumstances. As always, if there's anything you need in terms of accommodations, don't hesitate to get in touch and let me know. So today we're going to be looking at our last paper in our unit on reparations. We might say that's a mini unit as part of our unit on property rights and inequality. So today's paper is Reparations and Racial Inequality by Derrick Darby. So here's just a quick little bit of biographical information on our author today, Darby. He teaches philosophy at Rutgers University, and previously he taught at the University of Michigan and the University of Kansas, among other places. His research focuses on the intersection of rights and liberal theory in general with race and racism. And he's currently focusing on a project on W.E.B. Du Bois and democratic rights. So Du Bois is a really pivotal figure in African-American thought. So it'll be interesting to see where that project goes when Darby releases it. If you want to learn a bit more about some biographical information on Darby, you should check out his TEDx talk called Doing the Knowledge. So I'm going to give you guys a link to that, or you can just Google Doing the Knowledge to find that pretty interesting talk, which sort of discusses the intersections of hip-hop and philosophy with some connections to Darby's own life story, growing up poor in New York City. But our topic today is going to be on reparations and racial inequality. So here's like a starting moral principle that Darby proceeds from and sees as like a really pivotal thought in the reparations debate. So this is Aristotle from his classic book, the Nicomachean Ethics. So the Nicomachean Ethics says, if a victim is wronged by a perpetrator, then the perpetrator has a prima facie moral obligation. So that's like a on the face of it, or it's not like the only thing that we have to consider, but if it is the only thing in play, then it will generate a moral obligation. So the perpetrator has a prima facie moral obligation to make the victim whole by restoring the status quo ante. That is, the way things were before the injustice, before the wronging, so far as possible for the wrongful harm. So this is about some kind of reparative justice principle. Now, you might contrast and also see similarities between this principle that Darby is thinking about and the Lockean and Nozickian principles of reparation. Those were especially focused on rights and holdings when it came to Nozick, and about restoring or repairing natural rights as much as possible for Locke, as we saw in the Boxall paper last time. So let's look at sort of the basic corrective justice argument for reparations. So the corrective justice argument basically takes this Aristotelian principle, and then it builds it out in the context of the reparations debate. So the first premise in this argument says black chattel slavery was a wrongful harm against slaves perpetrated by slaveholders. 2, it says that slaveholders had a prima facie moral obligation to make slaves whole by restoring the status quo ante so far as possible before the wrongful harm. So again, that's basically just a direct application of the Aristotelian principle. 3, some form of reparations to slaves would accomplish this, so therefore slaveholders owe slaves some form of reparation for the harm of enslavement. So that's the basic corrective justice argument for reparations. We saw something very similar to that in Boxall's paper. Boxall was calling this argument the counterfactual argument, right? So a question might arise here, and the question is this: what does this show about what's owed in a present-day context? Because this argument is only about what slaveholders owe to slaves. And in the American context, slavery has not existed for well over 150 years, right? So we might wonder whether there's any argument for reparations today. So a possible reply that a defender of reparations might make is to claim that we might shift the focus away from individual victims and individual perpetrators to empirically demonstrable patterns of black-white inequalities. So insofar as we can find demonstrable patterns traceable to wrongful harms, then we can use that as our explanation for why present-day black people are owed reparations. So that's a way that a defender of reparations might go. But this is going to raise a question, and we might remember Waldron's point from earlier. It says that changing circumstances and the passage of time can supersede historical injustices. Basically, the longer things go and the less people actually center their lives around what's been unrightfully taken from them, the less of an obligation there is to restore the victim to the level of status quo ante. But we might also recall from Boxall's paper that maybe there's a point that can be made here, and it's that the wrongs done to black people are not ancient wrongs. So you'll remember that Boxall made the point, if slavery put black people on the mat, that is, if it knocked them down, subsequent policies, Jim Crow policies, redlining policies and housing, which we'll discuss a little bit more later, are things that made sure that African Americans were kept down, right? They were prevented from recovering from the injustices of slavery. And there's equal responsibility for preventing a person from recovering as there is for actually harming them in the first place. That was the thought that Boxall had last time around. You'll remember that was basically the revised counterfactual argument. So we have wrongs coming right up to the present day that deserve reparation. So we can note in these similarities to Boxall's argument, there are a couple of features to this argument that Darby points out. One, it avoids taking the argument all the way back to slavery. So we don't have to make the tendentious claim. Tendentious just mean an arguable claim, one that a lot of people might disagree with, that the current state of affairs is completely explained by the institution of slavery all the way back then. Instead, it's going to focus on empirically demonstrable and quantifiable harms, harms such as how housing policy has affected present-day black wealth. It shifts focus from an individual-centered perspective in which we look for specific victims and perpetrators. So remember, in the original argument, we had slaveholders and slaves, right? But in this shift away of focus from individual victims, now instead of talking about individual perpetrators, we're going to think about a group-centered perspective, as Darby calls it. So we want to think about black people as a whole and the disadvantages that they've been placed under collectively. And we might also start thinking about the advantages that white folks have benefited from in a society that discriminates. So, in this context, taking this approach, it's going to suggest that the most fitting reparations, if the case can be made, should be aimed at yielding greater equalities from group to group and across a wide range of measures of well-being. So when we talk about different measures of well-being, we might talk about access to education, healthcare, overall wealth, and so forth. So, what we encounter now is that there might be some possible criticisms about the corrective justice argument that we might worry about. One is that it depends on counterfactual reasoning. So we talked about counterfactual reasoning in our discussions of Waldron and Boxall. Remember, the idea of a counterfactual statement is that a counterfactual is about what things would be like if something that did not occur had occurred. So for instance, the example I've been giving you is if Kennedy had not been assassinated, he would have won a second term in office, right? And so forth. So Darby is just going to point out that maybe we want to see if we can develop a version of an argument for reparations that doesn't depend on these counterfactual claims. So he's saying maybe we can develop a version of the argument that doesn't say anything in particular about how well off black people would be if slavery had not been a thing, or how well off black people would be if they hadn't suffered from extreme housing injustices and inequalities in the 20th century. Moreover, he points out that there is like a really difficult and deep question about whether we can give an empirically articulated and quantified defense of the claim that present-day black people as a whole are suffering collectively as the result of previous policies and laws. So the point here is that there's maybe a lot of assumptions going into the basic corrective justice argument for reparations, as well as the more complicated version of the corrective justice argument that appeals to more recent social causes of the black-white wealth gap. So this question in social sciences about how we explain racial inequalities becomes really important. What social scientists do, that's like what sociologists and anthropologists and economists are doing, is they might try to give theories and explanations of why the black-white wealth gap is the way it is, how it got to be that way, why it's so large. So here's what Darby says. He says one way that we might go in explaining these disparities in health, wealth, and educational outcomes, for instance, it might hold that the root cause of these disparities does not have anything to do with the actions of black people in general, or even a small set, for example, the so-called ghetto poor. Rather, the root causes of the relevant racial disparities are deeply rooted in past and continuing practices of systemic discrimination and subordination of black people that have placed them at serious competitive disadvantage relative to white people in taking advantage of opportunities, competing for resources, and overcoming a range of obstacles to overall well-being. So that's one approach that we might take to this question. So the black agent neutral explanation of disparity basically says we can understand these disparities in the way that they're deeply rooted in past and continuing practices of systemic discrimination. So we say it's not that Black people make worse choices that explains why they are worse off. It's just that the system is rigged against them, that they are unable to compete for resources, and that they face a range of obstacles in achieving things like health, wealth, and educational outcomes. So the corrective justice argument, this more nuanced version that appeals to more recent wrongs, is going to appeal to these kinds of Black agent neutral explanations of inequality, which means that critics of reparations have often disputed the particular historiography and empirical explanations that Black agent neutral explanations rest on. So insofar as somebody wants to resist reparations for Black people, they might start to challenge this Black agent neutral explanation of social disparities. They might say that simply appealing to systems or simply talking about an unfair competition of resources leaves something out of the explanation. So in more general terms, and this is Darby's words again, he says these critics of reparations are going to opt for what might be called a Black agent relative explanation of persistent inequalities, holding that the lion's share of persistent racial inequalities has to do with the exercise of Black agency, at least on the part of some Black people. For example, the ghetto poor, though not necessarily all Black people. For instance, the Black middle class and wealthy Black people. So the idea here is if we want to explain why there is a Black-white wealth gap, for instance, we should explain it in terms of choices that Black people have actually made in their lives. So we would say that if we accept this explanation, that maybe the reason why, let's say, there is more poverty or lack of education is because there are certain folks within the Black community who don't make responsible choices. So this is like an alternative view that some social scientists might adopt as a hypothesis for what explains the Black-white wealth gap. Not to mention other disparities like health or educational outcomes. So, what's going on here? Well, Darby, he isn't saying that Black agent neutral explanations are false. So remember, the agent neutral explanations are the ones that appeal to systems rather than choice, right? It's the Black agent relative explanations that appeal to choice over systems. So Darby isn't saying that Black people are poor because of the choices that they've made, but he does say this. Appealing to agent neutral explanations, that is, saying we should understand inequality in terms of systems and obstacles, he says, will not be an easy road to hoe in this so-called post-racial era in America. He says some things about the civil rights movement here, about how everything is supposed to be a level playing field after that. Within this post-racial ethos, he continues, Black agent relative explanations of racial disparities have considerable appeal. And one important implication of this appeal is to make corrective justice arguments for reparations tethered to Black agent neutral explanation of racial inequality. It's going to make that a much harder sell, both to the general public and within scholarly circles. Therefore, at least in the short run, we may do better to mount a normative argument for Black reparations that takes into account persistent racial inequalities, yet reaches that conclusion irrespective of how we ultimately explain the empirical causes of persistent racial inequalities. So what's he saying here? He's saying that within the context we live, the idea that people's circumstances are the product of their choices is something that's appealing to a lot of people. Now, it's actually hard to tell. I would want to ask Darby, if I had the chance, whether he's saying he finds it appealing or whether the considerable appeal to agent relative explanations is one that's just something that a lot of people accept, both in the general public and scholarly circles. But what he does seem to be saying is that you're going to convince more people that reparations are owed to Black people in America if you don't make this appeal to agent neutral explanations, which basically says that inequality is to be explained in terms of unjust systems and systemic barriers to flourishing. So he's saying at least it's going to be a much harder sell to make that kind of argument than it is to find one that's maybe compatible with this agent relative approach, which has a lot of appeal to a lot of people. So we might think of this as a pragmatic rather than an epistemic case against making the corrective justice argument. So Darby has not given us reasons to deny that we can understand inequality in terms of oppression and systems. But what he is saying is that you're not going to convince many people if you make that kind of argument. So rather than saying about whether or not there are good reasons to accept the corrective justice argument and the Black agent neutral explanation of inequality that comes along with that argument, he's going to say, let's try to set that all aside. You're going to convince more people and you're going to achieve your goals if you don't rest your argument on that kind of explanation of inequality. So here's the alternative proposal that Darby lays out. He says, instead of focusing on a normative ideal of corrective justice, we could focus on a different normative ideal, right? So, a normative ideal here is just a fundamental moral principle that's doing the work. So he says we should appeal to the norm of freedom as self-development. So I actually screwed up there. Forgot to give you the page number. So let's just pull it up really quickly. Fix that up. So this idea of freedom of self-development comes on the last page of the essay, page 64. So here's how that alternative proposal works. He says that inequalities are obstacles to individual self-development and thus should be eradicated as a matter in justice. So for instance, it's a matter of justice that everybody have access to health, education, because when you have inequities in health or education, that's going to, or housing, those things are going to hinder human flourishing. So we make people free by allowing them to become the best people that they can be. And in doing that, we have a reason to make sure that these obstacles are removed from society whenever possible. So this argument, Darby points out, does not depend on any particular explanation of the root causes of inequality. It doesn't matter whether these inequalities are explained to some extent in terms of black people's choices, or to no degree. So because we don't have to make these tendentious claims, we can just say, look, human flourishing needs to get rid of inequities in health, education, housing, and whatever else we think is needed to achieve this normative ideal of freedom as self-development. So you might note here that the similarities here might be found between Darby's approach and Elizabeth Anderson's approach that we saw a couple of weeks ago, because Anderson points out that freedom and equality are actually not in competition with each other. To make somebody free is to give them access to certain kinds of flourishing, give them capabilities, right? One thing that Darby points out is this ideal of freedom of self-development is part of it's part of the foundation of liberalism, an approach to politics that focuses on liberty as a really important thing. So this alternative proposal that Darby lays out on the last page, we can see that there's a lot that we might think is influenced by, or maybe just in conversation with, the approach to justice that Elizabeth Anderson discussed earlier. So, just to recap quickly, some versions of the corrective justice argument that we saw today, they appeal to explanations of the root causes of racial inequality. There are Black agent-neutral explanations of racial disparities, and they say that these disparities don't have to do with the actions of Black people, but that disparities are deeply rooted in past and continuing practices of systematic discrimination, whereas Black agent-relative explanations of disparity explain those inequalities by appealing to the exercise of agency, that is, exercise of choice, on the part of at least some Black people. And then we saw that Darby has proposed an argument from freedom as self-development. So freedom as self-development is saying that we make people free when we give them opportunities to develop certain features of their flourishing. It doesn't depend on any particular explanation of where the inequality came from, but we might use that as a way of defending a case for reparations for Black people. So that wraps things up for today. And that's going to wrap up our unit on property and inequality. And we've seen a bunch of different approaches to reparations. So this reparations question, and moreover these broader questions about inequality, could be a great topic for your final term paper. And starting next week, we're going to get to work on a new unit that I'm calling Democracy and Its Discontents. And we're going to go back to the classics. So the first thing we're going to look at next week is Book 8 of Plato's Republic. So I will look forward to continuing that discussion, or continuing our discussion by looking to Plato and what he wrote about democracy in the Republic. So thanks for listening in today, and be well.